Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the latest in the series of Our Changing World lectures. And my name is Sandy Chudup and I'm the head of the School of Geosciences, and so it's my privilege to be able to introduce tonight's speaker and to tell you a little bit about the talk that we're going to have. So the title of the talk is the Greening of the Arctic, and as many of you will know, Edinburgh and the region has got a very long history of exploration and scientific discovery in the two facets of this talk, which are terrestrial ecosystems. So Charles Darwin did spend some time at the University of Edinburgh. What we don't say so much about is that he didn't finish his degree here, he moved on to better things. But he obviously was a pioneer in trying to understand what controlled evolution, and in so doing was looking at what controlled ecosystems as they develop, what is the fundamental ecological drivers. We also had John Muir, who hailed from just down at Dunbar, who then left Dunbar as a teenager, but then set up the national park system in North America, and by many people's standards would be seen as the father of conservation measures on grand scale. We've also had pioneers in exploration of the polar areas. William Spears Bruce comes to mind, who was a pioneer both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. If I jump more recently, the university has got some of the leading experts on looking at the drivers of climate change and variability, looking at the recent changes and at the projections of the future. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us now this evening to reflect on that intersection between the changes that we're experiencing in the climate system and other associated changes, and what is happening in the polar regions, and in particular to the ecosystems in the polar regions. These are areas that are experiencing the most dramatic and fundamental changes on Earth at this time. So it's an especial pleasure to welcome today's speaker. It's Isla Myers-Smith, and Isla is in my school, and I would say that she's a wonderful colleague. So I'll give you a few facts. So Isla did her undergraduate degree at the University of British Columbia, then went on to do a master's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then her PhD at the University of Alberta. After a couple of brief postdocs in Canada, she then joined us in 2013 as a Chancellor's Fellow, and she's recently been promoted to Senior Lecturer. If I was to characterize some elements of Isla, energy and enthusiasm would be top of the list. And there's maybe three areas that I could expand this in a little bit more. First of all, she's got a real passion for working outdoors and providing that link between observation, experimentation, and underpinning theory to understand what drives change. So even although she's only been working as an academic for a relatively short number of years, she's already undertaken 12 field seasons in the Arctic and sub-Antarctic area. Isla also loves working at scale in terms of identifying and addressing some of the really big fundamental questions that face us in terms of what drives change. And also scale in terms of her ability to network and bring together large communities of researchers. So she leads and has instigated two major international networks, which is a huge achievement, again, for somebody who's relatively early career. These speak to research excellence and ambitions, but Isla is also very passionate about teaching and about public engagement. And so last year she won one of our USA Teaching Awards. These are awards that are voted on by the student population, and it was for innovation in teaching. She's already engaged and given more than 20 talks to schools around the area, trying to make that link between what the academic endeavor is about and inspiring kids into thinking through how they may be able to participate in future. So with that introduction, I'd like you to welcome Isla Myers-Smith to deliver tonight's Our Changing World lecture on the greening of the Arctic.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for that lovely introduction, and it's a real honor to be here to give a public lecture at the University of Edinburgh. I'm just about 4 years into my position here, and this seems like a big moment. So I'm going to talk to you today about the greening of the Arctic, and I thought I would start this talk off with this sort of captivating image. This is from this summer when we were up in the Canadian Arctic, and this picture is taken from a drone. And what you see on the left side there is tundra with tussocks, these sedge tussocks, and then on the right side here, what's called a retrogressive thaw slump. So this is the permafrost, the frozen ground, thawing out into this big cesspool of mud. And what you don't really get from this picture is the height of that ice cliff there. It's about 40 meters tall, and a person standing on the edge there would be quite small in that picture. So this is one of the sort of dramatic changes that's going on in parts of the Arctic. And so I'll try and, through this talk a bit about the change that's going on in the Arctic in general, some of the findings of my research group, Team Shrub, we call ourselves informally, and then I'll try and finish up a bit with my perspectives on being a scientist and what my role is in terms of our changing world and how we can communicate the change that's going on to a broad public audience like yourself. Excellent. So the theme of this lecture series is our changing world, and what I want to do for you today is shift your perspective on how the world looks from Edinburgh to the top of the world. So here we are today. There is Scotland in the middle of that Google Earth image. And what I want you to leave the talk with today is a perspective more like this, looking down on the top of the world, thinking about the Arctic. So I just want to start off with a shout out to my research group, Team Shrub. They're sort of in the front here, many of them. This is a collective effort. What I'm presenting to you today is the work of many people working over the last couple days, madly getting things prepared so that you can look at them today. This is, excitingly, a talk with a lot of fresh, new data analysis and data in it. So these are works in progress. Come back, talk to me a year from now, and you'll get maybe a more complete picture of the changes that we're observing. But today, I'm going to focus the research that I'm going to present to you today on these three questions. Is climate warming causing vegetation change in the Arctic? Is vegetation change what satellites are perceiving as a greening? And how will vegetation change influence the carbon cycle? But I'm going to start off with the idea of where the Arctic might be. I think you have an idea right now, but here's a video sort of zooming in. Here we are in Edinburgh. And where I'm going to take you today in the Arctic is far to both the north, but also to the west, to the Canadian Arctic. So we're zooming over across Greenland to this island here. So this is Kikiktarik Herschel Island in the Canadian Arctic, and that's Pauline Cove. This is where we spent a couple months this summer. And if you zoom back out again, you can see where we are. We're just on the Arctic coast of the Yukon Territory next to Alaska, and about 2,000 kilometers, just over 2,000 kilometers to the North Pole. So in the sort of central part of the Arctic, a good bit farther north of where we are right today, but beyond the tree line, but not in the top of the world per se. So in this central part of the Arctic, which is a very key place to work because that's where a lot of the changes are going on. We also work in the southern part of the Yukon, and I just wanted to give you an idea of the scale here. So this is a picture of the Yukon Territory, that's the blue line, imposed on top of the UK. So our two field sites that we work at, both of the field sites in the summer are about 1,000 kilometers apart. That's like working in the very far north of Scotland and way down in Cornwall at the same time, in the same summer. And so these two sites span the subarctic up to the Arctic regions, and you've got the Kluane region down there where we're working in alpine tundra, so above the tree line in the boreal forest, and then up on the Arctic coast where we're north of the latitudinal tree line. And we also work with data sets from across the Arctic through these networks that Sandy referred to in my introduction. So when I was doing my PhD, and some of you might be early career researchers in the room, I knew that I was collecting similar data to some of my colleagues, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we got together, pooled these data sets, and then we could say something much larger? And so I, one day, sat down and I just made a website, and I called the website the Shrub Hub. I think actually my mother came up with that name. So it said the Shrub Hub at the top, and then it was just blank. But I put it online. Then I got distracted by my PhD and left it that way. And a year later, one of my colleagues found it, and he emailed me, Isla, what's with this website? Why has it got nothing on it? Do something. And so that stimulated me to form the network. So I started this network when I was in the second or third year of my PhD, and I continue to run it today. And we've added on some additional networks and teamed up with the International Tundra Experiment Network. And those big data sets allow us to make those scaling relationships that I'll present some of today to you. And so this is this idea of working with data from individual, say, plants like this dryas flower here, to the community level, all the plants that are growing together in association with each other, up to the landscape level where you see some of those dramatic responses like the permafrost thaw that I showed you in that first picture, and then being able to scale all the way up to the tundra biome, the entire top of the world. And I want to focus in on a particular part of the Arctic as well in this talk, and that's the Inuvialuit settlement region and this particular island, Kikiktarik-Herschel Island. And I want to emphasize that this is a place that is the traditional lands of the Inuvialuit people and has a long human history. And this is a photo from over 100 years ago at our field site, a family living at the field site. And then this is about 100 years ago, and these are European and North American whalers who overwintered at this field site. So it has this really long human history, and I won't go into that in great detail today, but it does influence the ecology perhaps that we're seeing on the landscape today, and is a really interesting mix of sort of history and ecology put together. And what's particularly cool is we actually get to do our research in the historic buildings. Our drone lab this year was in the oldest building in the Yukon, and hopefully we didn't do any damage to it. But it's really fun to have that mix of history in the landscapes that you're working in the modern day. So you can see on the left some of the graves left of the whalers that died at this site, and then those graves are still maintained and in place in the modern day. So that's a bit about where we're going in this talk, but what is the tundra? So the tundra is a biome that's above the tree line, and this is a picture from that southern site in the Kluane region in the southern part of the Yukon, and you can see those little dots on the mountain slopes. Those are trees, and as you move up the slopes, you'll see the dots become less frequent, and then at some point they stop, and then you get this sort of brighter verdant green. That's tundra with lots of shrubs in it. You're going to hear a fair bit about shrubs, one of my favorite types of plants. And then as you get towards the tops of these ridges, you can see that the tundra starts to go sort of browny gray, and that's where you're getting the sort of high alpine tundra where there's fewer shrubs, fewer plants in general, more bare ground. And in the distant mountains, you can see the ice fields starting. So you have these gradients either across elevation, like in this case, or across latitude, across the whole world. And once you're above that tree line, that's when you're in the tundra biome. So this is this Arctic field site. We looked at it on Google Maps already, and this is from the drone's eye view. There's the Pauling Cove settlement. That's where the whalers were. That's where the Inuvialuit lived. And here is just some pictures of what the tundra looks like up there. So you've got on the top of the island these sort of tussocks interdispersed and little bits of moss you can see in there, and there's also shrubs intermixed in that community. And then on the floodplains, you have really dense shrubby landscapes. And so we're looking at some of the changes going on in these different communities across this site and trying to figure out how that relates to the vegetation change going on across the tundra biome as a whole. So now I'm going to try and answer for you a bit about how the Arctic is changing. So the first thing that probably most of you already know coming into this lecture is that the Arctic is warming. So this is a map of the warming going on over the last 30 years or so. The redder it is, the warmer it's getting in terms of degrees C per year. And you can see that there's a lot of areas in the Arctic where there's quite an intense color of red. That means a lot of temperature change going on. Other parts of the Arctic haven't warmed as much, but in recent years, it's just sort of more of a general warming pattern everywhere, and those blue bits have turned to pink. And the other thing that you might know less about is that the Arctic is greening, though hopefully you had an inkling of that because of the title of this talk. So this is a map of the circumpolar Arctic again, and what you can see are sort of speckledy green and some brown and some gray bits. This is a satellite's eye view, if you can say that, like a bird's eye view, but from a satellite, of the change in the greenness of the surface of the Earth. So I'm going to delve in a bit deeper of what this NDVI index here is, but for now, just think about this as the surface of the Earth getting greener. And there's a bunch of reasons why it could be getting greener, and we'll think about that a bit more. But generally, seems like at least the satellites are perceiving that the Arctic's getting greener. But there's a whole bunch of other changes going on that relate to these sort of biome scale changes. So perhaps there are changes in herbivore abundance. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the sea ice declines that are going on. I've already mentioned permafrost thaw. There's also been some really large tundra fires in recent years, and there's a question of whether this is becoming a more flammable environment. It was a pretty flammable environment in the past, and maybe it's switching back into that mode. And then finally, what I'll probably focus most of the talk on today, and that's vegetation change going on in these systems. But I want to start you off with the beginning of our sort of Arctic field season this year. My PhD student Jakob sent me this image today. There is our field site, Ecological, on the coast of the Yukon Territory, and all those white blocks are the sea ice leaving for the summer. This is I think this is June 13th, and so the sea ice is leaving, which means we can get in there and land our plane, and we're just about to touch down for this summer's field season. And that's what it looked like from the plane. I was actually not on this flight, so this is, I think Jakob took this photo, and you can see the bits of the sea ice still in along the coast, but the open water has come in as well. And so spring has arrived. June 15th, that's summer in Scotland, but up here, it's the beginning of spring. But sea ice has been changing in the Arctic, and this is a video showing change over time. So we're in the 2000s right now, and you can see the white moving farther and farther away from that Arctic coast. And by the time we get to 2016, the sea ice pack, this is the minimum extent in the year. So this is just from, I think, last month, so the month of October, when the sea ice is at its lowest within the year. You can see it's moved way far away from the coast of the Arctic Ocean there, where our field site is. And that wasn't how the sea ice was about 30 years ago. So what you've seen is a decline in the extent of the sea ice, but also this little graph here shows a decline in the age of that sea ice, so that you have more young sea ice out there. You've lost the multi-year ice. And there are some scientists who suggest that perhaps within the next 20 years, we might have a totally ice-free Arctic Ocean within 20 years. And we might lose some of that older ice, which could come back again if it cools again. But it's a pretty dramatic change for this region. And the reason why sea ice has a big influence is this idea, so the albedo effect. So when you have a white surface, that white surface reflects the sun's heat off of the surface. And when you have a darker surface, like an ocean that isn't frozen, that absorbs the sun's heat. So through losing the sea ice or having it move farther north, we might be bringing more heat into these Arctic systems. And that could have global impacts. I want to show you some other photographs of our site. And this one is to demonstrate the types of disturbance that are going on, not just the retrogressive thaw slumps, the thawing of the permafrost, but also the erosion of the coastline. So here you can see some thaw slumps on the left side, and then you can see the slumping coming out into the water, and then you can see this sediment in the water coming off of the island and then off into the bluer waters here. So particularly in this part of the Western Arctic, and there's a lot of the coast of Siberia that is similar, you have really ice-rich ground, sediment in there, that once the ice thaws, the sediment can enter off of the land and into the ocean. And if you look at our focal field site here, Ecological, you can see the rates of erosion along the coastline. You can actually see the sediment in the water in this image. So the rate of change is indicated by the color of the dots here. The redder dots are greater rates of change, and the blue dots are actually a decline in coastal erosion in these areas from the past. So this part of the coastline always was eroding, or at least for the last 100 years or so. And it seems as if in some places that erosion rate is accelerating. There are also herbivores in the Arctic, as I alluded to before, and those changes in herbivore populations could have an influence on the ecosystem as a whole. So this is Murray or Betsy the muskox, who came by to visit our camp at the end of the summer this year. And he is one of the major herbivores on the island, influencing the plant communities that are there. One of the interesting things about the muskox population on this specific island is there used to be about 35 individuals last year, and all the females and the calves walked off the island when there was sea ice around in the wintertime, and they haven't come back. So we're just 3 males on the island this summer. So these kind of changes in that case, due to just perhaps random chance or decision on the muskox to leave the island, could be influencing the plants in the years to come. We also have different types of changing herbivore populations. So this is a tundra vole, and they have population cycles. So when they get to population highs, they have a bigger impact on the plant communities than when they're at lows. And one of the sort of questions that many of the animal biologists are trying to understand is how climate may influence herbivore populations. And of course, there's the predators. So there's actually a vole in the corner there, and that ermine has just grabbed it. Of course, their populations will influence the populations of the herbivores. And so you have this entire food web in these systems that will potentially be restructured by climate. And finally, something we have less clear-cut evidence for, but potentially is going on, is a change in distribution of different species. So on the left here, this is a walrus that we saw this summer at our site, and our site in the Arctic is not a place where walrus usually hang out. Presumably this isn't necessarily a climate thing, but it was pretty fun to see that walrus. And then on the right here, we have a western tanager, and this is a yellowbird species, what seems relatively tropical when you're way up in the Arctic. It's come about 1,000 kilometers north of its normal latitudinal northern extent, probably blown up by a storm. But the thought is that we'll be seeing more of these birds moving northward into habitats, particularly as the vegetation changes. But what I really want to focus for you today is about the vegetation change, the greening of the Arctic. And so what I'll present to you over the next few slides is some different lines of evidence for why tundra vegetation is changing and how we can link it to warming that's going on. And I'll be presenting lines of evidence from a variety of different sources, so from ecological monitoring, historical ecology, plant phenology, so the timing of events like the leafing out of the leaves and the flowering, dendroecology, so that's looking at the growth rings. So if you have a slice of wood, you can see individual rings, and each of the dark lines is the wintertime. You also get that with these woody shrub species in the Arctic, and you can use that to figure out how much that plant grew in a given year and relate it to climate. And then finally, experiments, like this very simple experiment that the International Tundra Experiment Network set up, which are these open top chambers, these small greenhouses that they put all around the Arctic to look at the impacts of climate warming on plant communities. And I'll start off with some historical ecology or repeat photography evidence of vegetation change, again from our field site, Kikiktarik. And what you can see here are two photographs, one from the late 80s, so not that long ago, just a few decades ago, and a photo of the same river valley this summer in 2016. And if you can sort of spot the difference here, in the photo on the left, you do have a sort of grassy, sedgy ecosystem. If you look in the back, there are some shrubs there, those sort of green cloud-like things in the background there, and you've got a river channel. And then the river channel's changed a bit, but around the river channel in 2016, you can see relatively dense shrub. So those shrub plants are now sort of knee to thigh high and growing every year. Each time I go back to the site, I can visually see the changes. It's that dramatic. They're growing maybe 10 centimeters a year, potentially, some of these areas. So big changes going on in certain parts of the island, and we're trying to understand what the actual mechanistic driver of that change might be. And we think that it has to do with climate, but it's quite hard to make that comprehensive link between the vegetation change and climate as a driver of that vegetation change. So for the next section of the talk, I'm going to try and convince you all that it really is warming one way or another. And I can start off here by letting you know that there's a pretty reliable source that already thinks this is a big deal here, and that's the International Panel on Climate Change reports, and they have suggested that the tundra ecosystem, so that's the little box there with the number 10 in it, are one of the best examples on the planet as a whole of a system where we have a high degree of confidence in the detection of a sort of change due to climate change and the attribution on the y-axis here of that change to climate. So this detection attribution framework that you might have heard a bit about in previous climate change talks, the tundra biome is like right at the top there in the high box there, so one of the best examples of this on planet Earth. And here are the reasons why. These are the same studies that are reported in that IPCC report. But before I go into those studies, I just want to touch on the idea of whether the Arctic has been warm in the past and whether the climate's changed in the Arctic in the past. And so if you go way back, you can find things like this. This was a rock and a fossil, some sort of conifer species that actually a paleontologist on the island found this summer on the beach. So this is going back hundreds of thousands of years. We don't even know how far back, but yes, there were forests in different parts of the Arctic in the far past. Then there was an ice age, and just at the end of the ice age, these remains might have been deposited. These were also found on the beach this summer. This is a jaw of an ancient horse and the hoof of an ancient horse. And that species doesn't exist there nowadays. So it's pretty exciting to just be walking along the beach and then find prehistoric animal remains just washing up on the shore. These are coming out of the thawing permafrost. But if we want to know about the plants and how the plants might have changed in the past, one of the best ways to look at this is by looking at lake sediments. So if you dig a core into the bottom of a lake, you get this sort of sedimentation in these layers. And each of those layers is an annual yearly deposit of sediment. So quite similar to those growth rings in the shrub species I was telling you about before. And then you can slice up that core and look at the bud in there and find the pollen inside that mud and look at the abundance of that pollen, and it tells you a bit about the plants that were there when that bit of sediment was laid down in the bottom of that lake. And then if you date the sediment and date the carbon in it, you can put together a picture like this. And what this sediment core suggests is that these are two shrub species, a Betula nana, which is a sort of dwarf birch shrub, and Alnus fruticosa, a sort of taller nitrogen-fixing shrub. And they both seem to be more abundant in these systems in the past than they are today, particularly in the 14,000 to 6,000 years ago period. There are also charcoal records in these sediment cores suggesting, again, that it was this more shrubby ecosystem in the past that probably burnt more often with tundra fires. So not very long ago, it was shrubbier in these systems. Then it got colder, the vegetation changed in response to that, and maybe now it's changing again. So are tundra plants responding to the warming? Yes, they are. So here are some lines of evidence for why we think that this is the case. We know that shrubs increase when you warm them up. And here's a figure here, a summary of data from sites around the tundra biome. There's the map with all the sites on it. And what you see here is on the x-axis, you have the amount of summer temperature change across all these sites. And on the y-axis, you have the probability of increasing abundance in tall shrub species. So you can see that linear relationship as you go higher over here with the warmer summer temperature change, you have a high probability of increasing shrubs, and where the summer temperatures have not changed or even cooled a tiny bit, you have a lower probability of increasing shrubs. So shrubs increase when you warm them up in their cover on the landscape. And these come from data sets, sort of ecological monitoring data sets that are pictured there in the corner. If you experimentally manipulate these systems with these open-top chambers, what you find is that shrubs and other plant species grow taller. So again, this is synthesis from sites across the Arctic. And what you have on the x-axis here are different vegetation functional groups. So you've got the shrubs, the forbs, so flowering plants, and graminoids, so grasses and sedges. And then you have the increase in their height after you've worn them. So what we know is shrubs and other plants grow taller when you warm them up. And we also know that shrubs grow more when it's warmer. So this is a map, again, of sites from around the circumpolar Arctic. And this time, we're working with those dendroecological data, the growth rings in the wood of the shrub species. And where you see a red circle, that's where the growth related with some climate variable. And the larger the circle, the stronger that relationship was. But you can also see X's on that graph. So those are the places where the growth of shrubs was not related to climate. So something else might be controlling those factors. And one of my PhD students, Sandra, who's here in the audience, is looking at whether plant-plant competition, so the plants sort of fighting with each other for resources, is why you're not getting climate sensitivity at all of these sites around the Arctic. And one of the things we've been working on in our research group over the last few years is to try and team up with the Yukon Territorial Parks at this site where we work and the local people, the Inuvialuit Rangers working there, to sort of create a bigger picture of what's going on. And so we have an ecological monitoring program. Some of the data are collected by the local rangers and some of the data are collected by ourselves, and we're trying to integrate those data sets to get a picture of what's going on at this one field site that we can link to the data from being collected at all these other field sites. And that's a photo of us in the field. I think that was in 2015, and some of the different communities that we're monitoring. And we're also trying to do this ecological monitoring across scales. So we're trying to measure things from the individual, so that individuals along a transect when they're flowering out, when their leaves are opening up, to doing measurements at the community level. This is a phenocam, so a time-lapse camera set up looking at the tundra ecosystem. And then recently we've added a new element into this ecological monitoring, and that's using drones to get a more landscape perspective of the changes that are going on. And so here's just a little video of one of those phenocams. And if you keep an eye out for the white flowers that are starting to appear, there they come. We're using that phenocam to understand the change in these driest flowers over time and to link across those different scales. And so here are some of the changes that we're seeing. And I wanted to show you just these first 2 data points because this is when I started working at this site. I was doing my PhD and I arrived up here and there were these 2 years of previous ecological monitoring data to work with. And then I went out to the site and collected data in 2009. And I saw a bit of an increase in vegetation cover and a decrease in bare ground. And my first thought was, I'm probably following the protocols wrong. I've done something wrong. That's why my data are different from the data that came before. But I thought, I don't know, I've read them as carefully as I can. Maybe it's a real relationship, but we'll see. And then when I came here to the University of Edinburgh, I had the opportunity to go back to this site and collect the ecological monitoring data again. And we've been continuing that data collection over the past few years. And these are the sort of changes that we're starting to see now. So that increase in vegetation cover across these 2 vegetation communities where the ecological monitoring plots are located, and a decrease in bare ground, and that relationship is getting stronger and stronger over time. So quite dramatic vegetation change, and each year it's a surprise when we analyze the data and see how strong these relationships are and how they continue to increase or decrease. And we can look at other measures as well. So this is the canopy heights of the plants in these same plots. And the plants are getting taller. So not only are they getting more abundant over time, they're getting taller over time. And then we can look at when the leaves are greening out in the spring, and we're seeing that it's happening a bit earlier over time as well. And so we're currently working on synthesizing these data as a research group and also working with the Invernahyle Rangers to put this picture of the vegetation change going on at that site together. And each summer we're out there, we do a little informal search for the tallest shrub we can find to get a feel for how the vegetation is changing. And here are some of the shrubs that we've met over the years. So in 2014, Gunther was the tallest shrub. 2015, it was Björn. And then this year, it was Christine, who's a less robust individual, but quite tall, quite tall. And we're also working on testing the growth rates of these shrub species in a warmer environment. And so this happens at our southern field site, where we're in the boreal forest, taking these tundra species into this warmer common environment and growing them in a common garden experiment. So you can see the common garden experiment in the middle there, and we've got individuals from this Arctic site and individuals from the Alpine in the Kluane region all together, growing together, and we can look at their growth rates over time. And there's a picture of the common garden experiment from the air, and what we're finding is that when brought into this warmer environment, these shrubs can grow really, really fast once you remove the other limitations to their growth. So this shrub's been fertilized a bit, it gets watered all summer long, and now it's growing 1 meter every year instead of the 3 to 5 centimeters it would grow in the wild. So to answer that question, is climate warming causing vegetation change? I think the answer, for me at least, is a definitive yes. But what we want to do in our research group and as a tundra research community as a whole is get more quantitative so we can make quantitative predictions of how the vegetation is going to change in the future. Next question. Is vegetation change what satellites are perceiving as greening? So I told you a bit about how the Arctic is getting greener, and I showed you those, one of those maps at the top there. Here's the sort of trend over time across various regions of the Arctic, and the Arctic as a whole in the middle there. And you've got this increase in green that's actually kind of tailed off in recent years. And you can also look at that as a map of, say, our Kikiktarik Island site, and you can see that according to the satellite data, it seems to be getting greener across that surface, but there's heterogeneity in that response. So the satellite data sets have different pixel sizes and different properties, and they don't always line up perfectly, but we want to test whether what the satellites are perceiving are really vegetation change on the ground. And I told you I would tell you a little bit about what this greenness index is, this thing that we tend to call NDVI, and here's the sort of simple mathematical formula for it, but if you really want it down to the simplest answer possible, it's the greenness of the vegetation. And you can check out this link if you want to know more about it. I don't have time to go into it today. And what we're trying to do at the moment is link the sort of plot level, individual level data to the biome scale data that the satellites perceive using drones on the landscape. So this is research that's very much underway at the moment. I'm going to run through a few of our sort of early data products, and we'll try and get to some of the answers that we're seeing. So this is one of our drones. This is Shrubcopter. Notice the little shrub on the canopy there. And this is a video of us getting ready to do some drone ecology research. So what you can see here is the drones in the middle of the group of people getting set up, and it's actually being filmed by another drone. And it's about to be placed on the landing pad, and then it will take off into the air. And there it goes. And then it will go up and do a lawnmower pattern across this region. So you can see the drone zipping by that icebreaker in the distance. And then we land it once we've monitored this area as a whole. So that's working with hexacopter drones. We also work with fixed-wing drones. And this is a fixed wing getting set up and time-lapse here. And our colleague Jeff. And there's our postdoc Andy in the distance there. So when you work with drones, you have to do little silly dances like this one. And with these fixed-wing drones, you sort of fly them like a paper airplane off into the distance. And they can stay in the air for a lot longer, up to 45 minutes. The multicopter drones only can stay in the air for about 10 minutes. So another flight takeoff there. And you can see the mosquitoes zooming around in the distance as well. And then it's a lot of waiting while the drone does its thing and collects its data. And you watch it, make sure it doesn't fall out of the air prematurely, because the way to land it is just to do a sort of gentle crash in the tundra. And there it goes. And then you end up with amazing images like this that you can then turn into data. And so this is hot off the press, as in today. My PhD student, Jakob Asman, in the audience here, has been working on looking at the greenness across the growing season. So here you've got data from June, July, and August of this year. And we're going to link that to what the satellites are perceiving in the same time of the year. So if we can understand the greenness changes across the growing season, that will help us understand the greening changes going on over time across these sites. And so the greener parts of this landscape have a higher NDVI index, and the yellower to redder parts of the landscape have a lower NDVI index. And you can really see that greenness pattern just in those images right there. And Andy, the postdoc that I mentioned before, is working with the sort of structure that these 3D models you can make out of drone imagery. So if you take many, many photographs, stitch them together, you can actually make a point cloud of data. It's kind of like LiDAR data, except for way cheaper, if you know what that is. And so it becomes a 3D model like this. So this is one of the shrubs from our common garden experiment, and you can see the individual leaves and stems in that model. And so we can collect data like this to watch the shrubs grow, basically in our data over time as we monitor them across the growing season and across years. And I wanted to just briefly touch on another application of this drone data that we're working with. So this is a video taken again from a drone of that impressive retrogressive thaw slump that I introduced to you, one of the biggest in North America and one of the biggest in the world. And you can see the permafrost there, the ice-rich permafrost, these big ice wedges, the cesspool of mud, that little yellow dot and the black dots around it, that's us filming in the distance. And we can take data of this and turn it into a 3D model that you're seeing here. So a 3D structure of those images, and we can use that to look at the change and the rate of thaw in this permafrost feature over time. So we're hoping to go back to the same site next year and make another three-dimensional model and look at the change that's going on. So we can actually be monitoring tundra vegetation change and tundra permafrost change as it happens. But while that's all going on and while we're doing the data processing, we've also been looking directly at what the satellites see to the changes that are going on the ground. And this is another map sort of like that previous one I showed you, relating the growth of shrub species, those annual growth rings, with the greenness in a given year that the satellites perceive. And what you can see is the sort of purple and the green dots there indicate that there is a correspondence between the growth of the shrubs and what the satellites are perceiving, but there's a lot more X's this time, and those are sites where what the satellites perceive don't seem to match up with what those specific plants are doing. So to sort of summarize here, is vegetation change what satellites are perceiving as greening across this sort of scaling relationship? I'm thinking now, though this is sort of preliminary analyses, that maybe not. Maybe the satellites aren't always perceiving the changes that are going on the ground. And we're wondering, as a research group, whether that's because there's a scale mismatch at the landscape scale. So there might be other factors going on, like changes in the amount of snow on the landscape, the snow melting off earlier, that can make the satellites perceive a greening signal, even if the plants aren't responding at that specific location. So we're going to dig in more here, and we'll have more answers for you in the coming years. And finally, I want to touch on how will vegetation change influence the carbon cycle. And this is, again, a part of our research that is still under development. But I just wanted to emphasize for you today that what I've been presenting to you thus far is about the above ground parts of these plants. And there's a lot more going on below ground, but it's a lot harder to measure. So this is a shrub that we dug up in the Kluane region. So Hayden there in the middle is carrying the above ground part of the shrub. It's only about 50 centimeters across. And then Sandra and I are holding out the root networks extending 5 meters in either direction. And that's where the roots broke off. They probably went much, much farther. And why carbon matters, particularly in tundra ecosystems, is because 80% of tundra biomass is below ground, and because 50% of the world's carbon are in these high latitude ecosystems. So if these ecosystems start to change and start to warm, and that carbon comes out of those ecosystems and into the atmosphere, that's a problem for global climate. And vegetation change could create feedbacks that would release these amounts of carbon and facilitate further climate change. So you could have feedbacks through nutrient cycling and carbon storage, or through permafrost thaw, albedo effects, and then influencing carbon again. And all of these feedbacks could accelerate climate change. So it's really important that we understand how vegetation change might be influencing carbon cycles. And so we've been setting up some experiments, and this is work that my PhD student Hayden has been doing. And he's been working with the humble tea bag, so a thing that all Brits love. Unfortunately, it's not black tea, it's rooibos tea and green tea, which gives us a common substrate. So we can look at decomposition at sites around the tundra biome and figure out how much of that decomposition is due to environment. And then we can put together these litter bag experiments where we look at the plants that are actually growing in these systems and figure out how much of the decomposition rate can be explained by the traits, the properties of those plants themselves. And so this work is ongoing, and Hayden's working on analyzing these data as we speak. But just to sort of summarize in pictorial form, what we think is going on is that when you have ecosystems with fewer shrubs, you have slower carbon cycling, so less CO2 coming into the ecosystem and less decomposition coming out. But as vegetation change progresses and you might get more shrubs and other plants in these systems, you have a speeding up, a faster carbon cycling rate, more CO2 coming into the biomass, but also more decomposition going out, more litter falling down. And so we think, though early days, that though the plants are changing, this won't necessarily influence the carbon cycling. There might be some offsets going on. So again, come back, talk to us in a year or two, and we can give you a more definitive answer. And so when we talk about our research, one of the questions we often get asked is, are these changes a good thing or a bad thing? And I think that depends on the specificity of the question. So is vegetation change a good thing or a bad thing for wildlife? Well, it depends on who you are. Moose might love it if there's an increase in shrubs. They prefer to eat these willow species and things, which are some of the shrubs that are responding most dramatically. On the other hand, caribou might not like it so much because one of their preferred winter forages are lichens, and lichens are actually decreasing in many of these experiments as we warm up these ecosystems. And then Arctic change, is it a good or a bad thing for people? It can certainly make life doing research in the Arctic more challenging, and presumably it could be a bit of a negative for people living in these places. So here are some photos of the Great Flood of 2016. You can check it out. We have a blog post, or a few blog posts all about it. We almost got evacuated in the middle of our field season because there was a storm surge coming in the same time as we had really high water levels, we had rain falling down, and our whole little community in which we were living got flooded. And then this is also our freezer on the island. It's a hole blasted into the permafrost that was made by the whalers, and we still use it today to keep our frozen food in it. But the building is starting to collapse in, so it was reinforced this year. If the permafrost thaws around that historic building, it is going to collapse at some point. And there's just a tiny clip of the Great Flood, Jakob making his way in hip waders through the water. So a question to sort of leave you with is, what can we do about the changes going on in the Arctic? And I actually struggle with this one. So I went ahead and did my own little personal carbon footprint today, I guess, looking at what my carbon footprint would be like without my Arctic research. And I'm still larger than the UK average, and I'm well over my sort of footprint. You can see the little red circle around the Earth. So 18 tons of carbon, my carbon emissions. But if you include our Arctic research into the picture, it blossoms up to be about 130 tons of carbon, and we're way over the UK average. So I'm a part of the problem, and so I don't want to sort of get on my soapbox here and tell all of you that we all need to reduce our carbon footprint when clearly I'm not doing a great job myself. I did bicycle here tonight, but we also have a role as private citizens, and tonight is the night or the day of the US election, and I am a US citizen in addition to being a UK and Canadian citizen, and I did vote. I'm trying to do my best to get political action in that way. But I struggle with what my role is as a scientist, and that's one of the themes of the Our Changing World lecture series. And one of the things that I feel pretty strongly about is that my role is to provide the evidence, but not necessarily to be an advocate for policy change. So what I've tried to do for you today is present some of the evidence, but I don't really have the answers of what we can do about the changes that are going on. But one thing I do think is we as scientists can do a better job of communicating our research, and in this case, Arctic change. And so that's through impact assessments and policy interfaces, through public communication and engagement, like the lecture tonight, hopefully. And we're also trying to explore some other ways that we can do this. And so this is a video we're putting together at the moment. So that's just a teaser clip. We've literally been putting that together over the last couple days. Archie Crofton in the audience is our communications expert and motion producer. So I'm going to finish the talk there with a brief summary here. Is climate warming causing vegetation change? I would say yes. Is vegetation change what satellites are perceiving as greening? Maybe not. How will vegetation change influence the carbon cycling? Perhaps the gains will balance out the losses. Perhaps too early to tell. And the take-home message is the Arctic is perhaps the most rapidly changing part of our world, and that there might not be much we can do to stop some of the ongoing changes that are happening right now. But we do need to gather the evidence and work towards the political action that could minimize the future change. So, high five, you made it through the talk. Just to point out that it's not always glamorous to work in the Arctic. So there's bears, and there's beautiful midnight sun, surprising belugas when you're flying your drone that you didn't even know were there, beautiful sunsets, sometimes the northern lights, not so much in the summertime because it's too light. And thanks again to Team Shrub for helping me put all of this information together, and to our funders. Thanks very much.
When I'm giving a presentation about the challenges and the changes, I show up on European Environment Agency slide of the tipping points. And methane hydrates in the far north is one of the, it's nearly always put in Siberia rather than that side. You focused on the vegetation. You mentioned the carbon stored underground. Can you talk a little bit, or is it in your field, about methane and that other greenhouse gas?
Excellent. Yeah, I know more about the sort of terrestrial sources of methane, so I'll maybe speak to that. This region of the Arctic where we work is quite similar to the regions in Siberia. So you've got, again, a lot of carbon in the ground in these frozen sediments. And so as permafrost thaws and as the surface of the soil is warming, if that's happening in a wetter condition, you do get methane released. If it's happening in a drier situation, then you get CO2 released for the most part. But a lot of where we're working is very wet. So you could see that one image that I showed of these ice wedge polygons, they're called, the patterned ground, and there's a lot of water in that system, and there presumably is a fair bit of methane coming off. You also have in the sort of Arctic lakes, I talked about the lake sediment cores there, you actually have bubbling of methane coming out of those lakes. And in the wintertime, when the surface of the lake is frozen, particularly in the early winter, so around now, if you go out to those lakes and you polish off the snow, you can see those bubbles. And if you crush them with, I don't know, a knife or something, and you have your lighter there, you can actually get poofs of flame from the methane released from those bubbles. So a colleague of mine, Katie Walters, has been working on trying to estimate the rates of terrestrial methane release through lakes. And it's quite a challenge to get at the methane side of the story. So one of the things that's going to be happening at our field site in that region of the Arctic next summer is that NASA's coming up with one of their planes, and they're going to be flying to collect a variety of different data, and one of them, I believe, is looking at methane fluxes across the larger landscape. And they should be flying right over our island, so maybe in future I can get back to you with more numbers.
Isla, that was a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
My question is about nutrients in the terrestrial ecosystem. So you showed very convincingly that as temperatures increase, we get bigger shrubs and taller shrubs, and therefore presumably an overall increase in productivity in the system. Is it possible that that will drive the system towards nutrient limitation, or are there plenty of nutrients in the soil to support an increase in growth?
That is a great question. I think we don't totally have the answer. So definitely these tundra ecosystems are nutrient limited. In particular, they're thought to be nitrogen limited, but they might also be phosphorus and potassium limited, depends on the location at which you're at. If you do fertilize these tundra ecosystems, they do respond quite dramatically. But some of those shrub species that are increasing are actually nitrogen fixers. So particularly in the southern parts of the Arctic, you have these alder shrubs that bring nitrogen in from the air into the ecosystem. So the thought is where those shrubs are, you should get increased nutrients in the system as they increase on the landscape. There's also mosses that nitrogen fix in these systems. So there are some other sources of these nutrients that might change as vegetation change progresses. But one of the things I didn't really talk about in this talk, but it's a really important change that's going on, is the deepening of the active layer, so the thawed part of the ground. So each winter, the entire ground freezes, and then as the summer comes, that ground starts to thaw down, and eventually it stops thawing, and that's where the permafrost starts, so the ground that stays frozen year-round. But over time, we've noticed, particularly at this Arctic site, we don't have the best records for this, but we're pretty confident it's going on, that the active layer is getting deeper. And deeper, and that's exposing ground that hasn't been thawed out for maybe hundreds, possibly thousands of years, and there might be nutrients locked up in that previously frozen ground that are being released to the plants. So we actually think that's probably the most likely mechanism for the vegetation change that we're seeing at that Qikqtarjuaq site, is a release of nutrients that the plants now have access to. They can grow their roots farther down into that nutrient-rich soil and take advantage of that. So nutrients are key to the whole story.
The other part of the growth equation, if you like, is instant light energy. And there must be two things that are relevant there. First of all, because it's a very far north, the amount of light is relatively limited compared with other parts of the world. And the other thing is the weather. How much sunlight do you get compared with clouds?
That's an excellent question and a really important thing again. So in the summertime, there is 24-hour light at the northern site there. So the sun is just circling around. It dips lower in the horizon in the darker hours. But you saw that time-lapse camera image. That was a picture taken every hour, and you saw how it never got dark in that video. So there is light all the time, but it's a different quality of light than we have down here. It's less direct, but actually that might be to the benefit of the plants. They are adapted to those light conditions, and that less direct, potentially diffuse light might be easier for them to use through their photosynthetic mechanisms. As you move to farther southern parts of the tundra biome, then you're getting more day and night, and it's more similar to the light conditions that we have here. But that question of how light influences the growth of these plants and whether they're light limited, perhaps, is a really important one. And it's very hard to distinguish from the climate change. So in these systems, in general, you get either warmer conditions or colder conditions, depending on whether there's cloud cover or not. And so what you could have is a situation that looks like sort of a warming trend over time that is actually a change in cloudiness that could be leading to a change in light conditions for those plants. And then maybe it's actually the light they're responding to instead of the temperature. But it's really hard to parse those two apart. So just like with the permafrost and the nutrients, it's an indirect warming mechanism. You could have changes that are going on with light conditions that are due to the cloud cover, basically. And it's really hard to figure out if that's what's going on when all you have available to you at these sites, because the MET stations are quite simplistic, is temperature data and sometimes precipitation data. So that's one of the challenges we have to work with. But definitely these plants are adapted to the light conditions under which they're growing. And that common garden experiment that I showed you the photos of, one of the findings, the preliminary findings of that, is that we can actually see evidence of that adaptation to the photoperiod amongst the Arctic versus alpine individuals in that common garden experiment. So light's a very big deal for sure.
So you're looking at change through time and trying to attribute that change to the different drivers. What do you do about getting historical records of herbivore numbers?
That is a great challenge. I even threw into this presentation a not great graph here of the sort of recent records of caribou and muskox populations at our one site. I was going to put it in the talk, but I didn't have time to beautify it. So here it is. So there's some data on herbivore populations at this one site. And one of the things we'd love to have is a much longer term record. And there is the possibility of delving into sort of the historical records themselves and understanding potentially what the harvest rates would have been for the traditional Inuvialuit way of life. There were people living year-round at this site at points in history, and then moving forward to when the European whalers were there, presumably they had a very big impact on the herbivores. Then they left in the early part of the 1900s, and then you had a pretty untouched island for quite a period of time and potentially allowing the herbivore numbers to recover. And in recent years, maybe there's an increase in caribou on the island, and like I said, a sort of dramatic decrease in muskox on the island this year. So we're hoping we can piece some of this part of the story together, but it's very challenging because there really aren't those early records that you would ideally like. Not here and not at most of the sites in the Arctic, but it's something that a lot of us Arctic ecologists are very interested in exploring.
Early in the presentation, you showed a picture of a pointing clouds thing for one of the plants that you've made through your drone research.
That's it.
What kind of uses does calculating a model like that actually have?
Great question. So what we're actually planning to do, that was sort of a test case of that the method works, is to actually make those kind of models across the sort of landscape level. So you saw that floodplain that I showed you. You saw the drone flying over it and some of the pictures on the ground. So we want to make the same kind of point cloud models across that whole floodplain. And then we want to do that over time. So both over the growing season, and we hope that we can even pick up the shrubs growing within a growing season, and then over multiple years. And I told you about how you can see almost 10 centimeters of growth in some of these areas if you're taking on the ground measurements. That's enough. That's within the resolution of that kind of three-dimensional model type of data. So we're hoping we'll be able to actually see the shrubs grow over time. And then we can look across the landscape to see where they're growing at faster rates versus slower rates. And that might help us get at that nutrient question, because we can estimate where the nutrients are going within that landscape based on the local hydrology. So we're hoping that these data can help us piece together this complex story of how warming might be influencing the active layer depths, the permafrost conditions, then the nutrients, and the plants responding to them. But we'll get back to you and if we can actually put that whole story together over the next couple years. You should talk to Andy in the front here. He can fill you all in on these methods. There he is, waving. We've got loads of other 3D models if you want to check out sometime. A polar bear skull and all sorts of fun things. It's a really amazing technology that's only now possible because of the sort of computing power to stitch all those photographs together, each pixel being matched up to each other pixel across hundreds of photographs. So it's a pretty cool technology.
It's my pleasure then to ask you all to thank Isla for her talk. I mean, what I took from that was just a wonderful flow through from the whole questions of where are we looking, what's changing there, but then the focusing in on what are the drivers of change. So we know that the Arctic is a place that's changing at a remarkably rapid rate. That doesn't mean to say it's easy to understand all the interrelationships between the physical and biological systems. And I thought we got a wonderful exposition of how you can use wonderfully rigorous science and creativity and teamwork to start to address some of these really large-scale questions. I also noticed that we couldn't get away without mentioning the election. It did come in there.
Yeah.
But I did notice that the winner in 2016 was the first female. Christine beat Gunther and Bjorn.
That's right. I should say that Bjorn and Gunther could also be females because they didn't have catkins on them, so we just picked names. But Christine was definitely female, I think.
Well, I was just looking at the ascendancy. So who knows if that's a harbinger. But
Yeah,
I would
hope
ask you to thank Isla very much for sharing her enthusiasm and knowledge.